The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, each a tiny ghost in the silent air of Elara's house. For 2 years, the silence had been a presence, a heavy blanket she'd wrapped around herself and her grandson, Leo. It was a quiet born of absence, a hush where laughter and the clumsy chords of a piano used to be. The world outside their small, white house on Sycamore Street went on. Of course, cars passed, neighbors mowed their lawns, the ice cream truck chimed its tinny song in the summer. But inside, time had stopped the day the phone call came. The day your son, Michael, and his wife, Anna, had been taken in a wreck on the interstate. Leo, who was only 6 then, had packed up his words and put them away in a place no one could find. He hadn't spoken since, not a word. He communicated in a flurry of pencil sketches on whatever paper he could find, napkins, the backs of envelopes, old receipts. His drawings were his language, filled with thin, solitary figures and vast, empty landscapes in shades of gray. Elara, with a heart that felt like a bruised apple, had learned to read them. A drawing of a bird with a broken wing meant his knee was scraped. A drawing of a leafless tree meant he was feeling the particular sadness that had no name. Her days followed a gentle, unchanging rhythm. Wake, make oatmeal Leo wouldn't finish. Sit with him while he drew, tend the garden, make sandwiches he'd pick at. Read to him from books whose endings he already knew, make a simple supper. And then sit in the deepening twilight, the silence growing heavier as the sun went down. The house was a museum of a life that was over. Michael's photographs were on the mantel, his old guitar leaned in a corner. And in the living room, under a thick, green-colored dust cover, sat the piano. It had been Michael's greatest joy. He wasn't a prodigy, but he played with a soulful touch that could fill the house with warmth. He taught Anna, and their clumsy duets were the soundtrack of Elara's happiest memories. After the accident, the piano had fallen silent. The first time she'd heard a key accidentally brushed a few weeks later. The sound was so sharp, so full of memory, it had brought her to her knees. The next day she covered it. It was easier not to see it, not to be reminded of the hands that once moved over its keys. Leo never drew the piano. It was a ghost too powerful even for his graphite world. One Tuesday in late September, as the first leaves were beginning to turn a burnished gold, a moving truck rumbled down the street and wheezed to a stop next door. The house, empty for a year, had been sold. Elara watched from her kitchen window, her hand still in the soapy dishwater. A woman with a kind, tired face and hair the color of honey jumped down from the cab, followed by a little girl, a whirlwind of bright red overalls and 2 bouncing pigtails. The girl couldn't have been much older than Leo. Elara felt a familiar pang of anxiety. New people meant new sounds, new expectations, the polite dance of introduction she no longer had the energy for. She watched as they unloaded boxes, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It felt like a sound from another world. Leo, who had been drawing at the kitchen table, looked up. He watched the little girl chase a stray leaf across the lawn. Then he picked up his pencil and drew a small, vibrant sun in the corner of his gray landscape. The next day, there was a knock on the door. Elara opened it to find the woman from next door holding a plate of cookies. She had a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Hi," she said, her smile genuine. "I'm Sarah and this is Lily. We're your new neighbors. I hope we weren't making too much of a racket yesterday. These are chocolate chip. I find they make an excellent peace offering." Behind her, the little girl, Lily, peered around her mother's legs. Her eyes were wide and curious. Elara managed a small, rusty smile. "Elara, and this is my grandson Leo." Leo stood behind her, half hidden, his sketch pad clutched to his chest. Lily waved a small, cookie crumb-dusted hand at him. He didn't wave back. But he didn't retreat either. He just watched her. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Sarah said. "Well, we'll let you get back to your day. If you need anything, please don't hesitate." As they turned to leave, Lily's eyes scanned the living room through the open door. Her gaze landed on the large, shrouded shape against the far wall. "What's that?" she asked, her voice clear as a bell. Elara's breath hitched. "That's just an old piano." "Can it play music?" Lily asked, her head tilted. "It used to," Elara said, the words feeling heavy in her mouth. She took the cookies and gently closed the door, the silence of the house rushing back in to fill the space their voices had occupied. Later, Leo showed her his drawing. It was the little girl, Lily, with her bright red overalls, and next to her, a large, rectangular shape with a question mark floating above it. The question mark hung in the air for the rest of the week. Lily was a persistent, gentle presence. She'd leave dandelions on their doorstep. She'd wave from her window. One afternoon, while Elara was weeding her petunias, Lily came over to the low picket fence that separated their yards. "My mom says pianos get sad when nobody plays them," she announced. Elara paused, her gloved hand hovering over a stubborn bit of clover. "Does she now?" "Yep, she says their strings get lonely." Lily looked at her with an unnerving seriousness. "Is your piano lonely?" Elara didn't know how to answer that. Lonely wasn't the right word. It was sleeping, grieving just like the rest of them. "It's just resting," she finally said. But Lily had planted a seed. That evening, as Leo slept, Elara found herself standing in front of the covered piano. The air around it felt thick, charged with memory. Her hand trembled as she reached out and touched the cloth. She could almost feel the vibrations of the last song Michael ever played on it. A simple folk tune he was learning for Anna. She pulled her hand back as if burned. It was too soon. It would always be too soon. The next day, it rained, a steady, gray drizzle that matched the mood inside the house. Leo was quiet, his drawings darker than usual. Elara was reading in the armchair when she heard a soft tapping sound. It wasn't at the door, it was at the window. Lily was standing outside on their porch, her face pressed against the glass, her breath making a small fog. She wasn't knocking to be let in, she just waved. Leo got up from the table and walked to the window. He stood a few feet back, just watching her. Lily, seeing him, smiled and began to hum a simple, made-up tune. She traced a little heart on the foggy glass. Leo watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, he lifted his own hand and traced a small, shaky circle next to her heart. A dam broke inside Elara. It wasn't a flood, just a small, painful crack. The sight of her grandson, so lost in his silent world, making that tiny gesture of connection, was unbearable. He needed more than she could give him. He needed a sound she was too afraid to make. She stood up, her knees creaking. She walked over to the piano. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath, gripped the edge of the dust cover and pulled. The wood, a rich, dark walnut, gleamed in the dim light. It was dusty but beautiful. Leo turned from the window, his eyes wide. He had never seen it uncovered. Elara sat down on the bench, the worn velvet cool beneath her hands. She lifted the lid that covered the keys. They were yellowed with age, a map of ivory and ebony. She didn't play, she couldn't, but she had opened the door. A few days later, Sarah knocked again. "I know this is a huge ask," she began, twisting a stray thread on her sweater. "And please say no if it's too much. But Lily's been talking non-stop about your piano. We had to sell ours when we moved. It was just too expensive to bring. She misses it terribly. I was wondering if, just once in a while, she could come over and just touch the keys." Elara looked past her, into her own quiet living room. She thought of Leo's drawing of the sun, of the circle on the window. She thought of the deafening silence. Of course, she heard herself say she can come over now, if she'd like. Lily entered the house with a reverence that surprised Elara. She walked straight to the piano, her small hands hovering over the keys as if asking permission. "Can I?" she whispered. Elara nodded. Lily pressed a single key, a middle C. The note hung in the air, clear and true. It wasn't sharp or painful. It was just a sound, a beginning. Leo, who had been hiding in the hallway, took a half step into the room. Lily began to play a simple nursery rhyme she knew by heart. Her timing was off, her fingers clumsy, but the room filled with music. Hesitant, imperfect, beautiful music. Leo sat down on the floor, tucked his knees to his chest, and watched, his skethpod forgotten in his lap. He didn't draw. He just listened. And as Lily played, a single tear traced a path through the dust on the piano's lid. Elara wiped it away, unsure if it was hers or the house's. The piano lessons, as they unofficially came to be known, became a part of their new rhythm. 3 times a week, Lily would come over after school. Sarah would join her, bringing a thermos of tea for Elara, and they would sit in the kitchen, their quiet conversation a soft counterpoint to the melodies drifting from the living room. Lily was a patient student of her own memory, slowly recalling old songs, figuring out chords. She never played loudly. It was as if she understood that the house was still healing. Leo was always there. He never sat at the piano, but he was no longer a shadow in the hallway. He would sit on the rug, his sketchpad in front of him. But his drawings were changing. He started using color, a splash of blue for the sky, a streak of green for grass, and in his drawings of people, small, curved lines began to appear by their mouths, not smiles, not yet, but the suggestion of sound. One afternoon, Lily was trying to play a song from an old, yellowed music book she'd found on the piano bench. It was one of Michael's. She stumbled over a difficult chord. "I can't get it," she said, frustrated. She tried again, and the notes came out jumbled and sour. Leo, from his spot on the floor, looked up. He put down his pencil, crawled over to the piano and pointed a small finger at one of the keys. Lily looked at the key, then back at the music, then at the key again. She moved her finger, she played the chord. It was perfect. She beamed at him. "How did you know?" Leo just looked at the keys, a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride. Memory, maybe both. He didn't have to speak. The music was speaking for him. Elara watched from the doorway, her heart a flutter of wings. Michael had spent hours teaching Leo his notes before he could even read words. He'd sit Leo on his lap, guiding his tiny fingers. He had forgotten. No, not forgotten. He had buried it. And Lily, with her bright overalls and clumsy, determined music, had helped him find it. That evening, Elara found a new drawing on her pillow. It was a picture of the piano. And sitting on the bench were two figures, a little girl with pigtails, and a little boy beside her. Both of them were smiling. And from the piano, a rainbow of colors flowed out, filling the entire page. The town of Cookhaven was the kind of place that held its history close. The old community hall, a handsome brick building on the town square, was its heart. It had hosted town meetings, harvest dances, wedding receptions, and Christmas pageants for nearly 100 years. Michael had given his first clumsy piano recital on its stage. Elara and her late husband had danced there on their anniversary. But the hall was old, the roof leaked, the wiring was ancient, and the town council was making noises about selling the land to a developer who wanted to build a block of sterile, modern condominiums. The news printed in the local paper felt like another loss. It was another piece of her past, of Michael's past, being threatened with erasure. She mentioned it to Sarah one afternoon over tea. "That's a shame," Sarah said, her brow furrowed. "It's such a beautiful building. Isn't there anything the town can do?" "They say they don't have the funds for the repairs," Elara said, a familiar weariness in her voice. "It's easier to tear it down and start over, I suppose." Later, as Lily played a soft melody on the piano, Elara looked at Leo. He was drawing the community hall, but in his picture a large wrecking ball was swinging towards it. On the ground below, his familiar, faceless figures watched. He felt it, too, the threat. An idea, small and tentative, began to form in Elara's mind. It was reckless and bold, and the thought of it made her palms sweat. A benefit, a concert to raise money to save the hall. She could almost hear Michael's voice, encouraging her, telling her it was a wonderful idea. But the voice was quickly drowned out by her own doubts. She was a recluse, a quiet grandmother who hadn't organized so much as a coffee morning in years. Who would listen to her? She pushed the thought away, but it kept returning, nudged along by the music that now filled her house. The piano, once a monument to her grief, was becoming a source of gentle strength. It had brought Lily and Sarah into their lives. It had coaxed color back into Leo's world. Maybe its music could reach farther than her own four walls. She broached the idea with Sarah the next day. "I'm probably crazy," she began. Sarah's eyes lit up. "Elara, that's a brilliant idea, a concert. Of course, we could get local musicians to perform, the high school choir, maybe a bake sale, a silent auction." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in a long time, Elara felt a spark of something like hope. "We could ask people to share stories about the hall, too," Sarah continued, already grabbing a notepad. "Make people remember why it's important." The first step was presenting the idea to the town council. Elara hadn't spoken at a town meeting in over a decade. The thought of standing in front of all those people made her stomach clench. Sarah offered to go with her. Even Leo seemed to sense the importance of the evening. Before she left, he handed her a drawing. It was of her, standing at a podium. She wasn't a small gray stick figure. She was drawn in color, and from her mouth came not words, but a stream of musical notes that filled the room. He had drawn her with a voice. The meeting was held in the library basement, a stuffy room with fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old paper. Elara's hands trembled as she held her notes. When her turn came to speak, her voice was thin and shaky at first, but it grew stronger as she talked about the hall, about its history, about what it meant to families like hers. She laid out the plan for the benefit concert, her words painting a picture of a community coming together. There were nods of support from the audience, but then Arthur Henderson, The head of the council cleared his throat. Henderson was a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and bottom lines. He had known Michael, had served on a committee with him once. He considered himself a pragmatist. "Elara," he said, his tone laced with a kind of weary condescension. "That's a lovely sentimental thought, truly, but we have to be realistic. A bake sale and a few songs aren't going to raise the kind of money we need. The developer's offer is solid. It represents progress, new tax revenue for Cookhaven. It's not just about the money, Arthur," Elara said, her voice rising slightly. "It's about our town's soul." Henderson gave a small, sad smile. "We all grieve in our own ways, Elara, and we all respect the memory of your son. Michael was a fine man. But we can't let nostalgia stand in the way of the town's future. Holding on to old buildings, sometimes it's just another way of holding on to pain. Maybe it's time to let go." The word struck her like a physical blow. He had taken her idea, her small spark of hope, and twisted it into a symptom of her grief. He had painted her as a sad old woman lost in the past. Unable to move on, the air went out of the room. The murmurs of support died down, replaced by uncertain silence. Henderson's pragmatism was a cold, heavy weight. The council voted to continue negotiations with the developer. The benefit concert was dismissed as a charming but futile gesture. Elara walked home, the chilly night air doing little to cool the sting of humiliation. Sarah tried to comfort her, but Elara barely heard her. Henderson's words echoed in her mind. Maybe it's time to let go. Was he right? Was this whole idea just her clinging to ghosts? Was she trying to save an old building because she couldn't save her son? When she got home, the house felt silent again. The piano stood in the living room, a dark, hulking shape in the gloom. The music felt miles away. She went to her room and closed the door, the heavy blanket of silence settling back over her. Colder and more suffocating than before, she had tried to step back into the world. And the world had told her to go back inside, back to her memories, back to her quiet grief. She didn't come out for the rest of the evening. She heard Sarah and Lily leave, their voices soft and concerned at the door. She heard Leo's quiet footsteps in the hall. She felt the weight of his worry through the wood of the door. But she couldn't face him. She couldn't face the hope she had seen in his drawings. She had failed him. She had let the silence win again. The next morning, the house was still. Elara had slept fitfully, the ghosts of Henderson's words haunting her dreams. She felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting a battle and losing. She considered covering the piano again. Maybe Henderson was right. Maybe it was time to let it all go, to accept the silence. She finally opened her bedroom door, expecting to find Leo at the kitchen table with one of his gray, melancholy drawings. But he wasn't there. The kitchen was empty. A flicker of panic went through her. She called his name, her voice raspy. No answer. She walked into the living room and stopped. Leo was sitting on the piano bench. He had never sat there before. Never. In front of him, propped up on the music stand, was not a sheet of music, but a large piece of drawing paper. He was sketching with a fierce concentration, his small hand moving rapidly. He wasn't drawing a wrecking ball or faceless figures. He was drawing the community hall. But it was alive. The windows glowed with golden light. Music notes, bright and colorful, floated out of the open doors. On the stage inside, he had drawn a man at a piano, his head thrown back in laughter. It was Michael, and in the audience, he had drawn dozens of people, all of them smiling, their faces turned towards the music. He had drawn the concert she had imagined. He had drawn the hope, not the failure. He must have heard her, because he stopped drawing. He turned on the bench to face her. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. And then he did something that shattered the silence of the past 2 years. He pointed to the drawing of his father on the stage. Then he pointed to the real piano, and then he looked at her and spoke a single, clear, quiet word. Play. It was not a request. It was a call to arms. It was a refusal to surrender. It was the voice of her grandson, returning from a long and lonely journey, to tell her not to give up. The sound of his voice, a sound she thought she might never hear again, was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a dam of grief finally, truly breaking. She walked over to him, knelt down, and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his hair. He was so solid, so real. He hugged her back, his small arms squeezing with a surprising strength. Okay, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Okay, Leo, we'll play. Something shifted in Cookhaven that week. It started small. Elara, with a newfound resolve, typed up a simple flyer. It didn't mention the town council or the developer. It just said, "Come share a song for the Cookhaven Hall." She and Sarah, with Leo and Lily trailing behind them, posted them in the grocery store, the post office, the library. People started talking. The story of Henderson's dismissal at the council meeting had gotten around, and it had rubbed some people the wrong way. They didn't like being told what their town's soul was worth. The first call came from Mr. Abernathy, the high school music teacher. "I heard what happened, Elara," he said. "The choir would be honored to sing." Then came a call from a local bluegrass band, the Rusty Strings. Then a folk singer who usually just played at the Saturday market. People started stopping Elara on the street, not with looks of pity, but with words of encouragement. They decided to hold the event on the lawn in front of the hall. They couldn't use the inside, but they could show the town what it was missing. The plan was simple: a few blankets, a borrowed sound system, and a bake sale table that groaned under the weight of contributions from half the kitchens in town. The biggest surprise came from Leo. He began to draw a series of large posters. Each one depicted a different memory of the hall, a wedding, a dance, a child on stage, all in his new, vibrant style. But he wasn't just drawing. He was talking, not in long sentences but in small, precious phrases. "More blue here," he'd say to Lily as they colored in the sky. "Dad liked this song," he'd whisper to Elara when a certain melody played on the radio. Each word was a miracle. The day of the concert was bright and crisp, a perfect autumn afternoon. People began to arrive, carrying lawn chairs and blankets. There were more than Elara had dared to hope for. She saw faces she hadn't seen in years, old friends who she had gently drifted away from in her grief. They greeted her with warm hugs and told her they were proud of her. Arthur Henderson was there, too. He stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The music started. The high school choir sang, their young voices full of earnest energy. The folk singer sang a ballad about changing seasons. The Rusty Strings got everyone tapping their feet. But the heart of the event was the stories. One by one, people stood up and shared what the hall meant to them. An old man talked about seeing his wife for the first time at a harvest dance in 1958. A woman spoke of her daughter's first ballet recital on its stage. With each story, the brick building behind them seemed to stand a little taller, its history palpable in the afternoon air. Then Sarah walked her daughter to the electric keyboard they had set up. Lily, in her red overalls, looked small in front of the growing crowd. She took a deep breath and began to play. It was the song from Michael's music book, the one Leo had helped her with. She played it beautifully, her small fingers moving with a new confidence. The melody, sweet and a little melancholy, drifted over the crowd. As she played, Leo walked to an easel that stood beside the stage. He picked up a piece of charcoal. In front of everyone, he began to draw. His hand moved with a fluid grace, and a picture began to emerge on the large white pad. He drew the town square, the old oak trees, the spire of the church. He drew the community hall, not as it was, but as it could be, lights blazing, doors open, filled with people, and on the steps, he drew 4 figures: a woman, a little girl, a grandmother, and a little boy, all holding hands. He drew them all in color. When he finished, a hush had fallen over the crowd. He had told their story, the story of the town, the story of their small, quiet fight. Without a single word, he put down the charcoal, looked out at the sea of faces, and gave a small, shy smile. The applause that followed was thunderous. It wasn't just for the music or the art. It was for the resilience, for the love, for the quiet courage it had taken to get to this day. People swarmed the donation jars. They stuffed them with 5s, 10s, 20s. It was more than just money, it was a vote. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, honeyed glow over everything, Arthur Henderson made his way through the crowd to Elara. He looked at the donation jars, at the smiling faces, at Leo, who was proudly showing his drawing to a group of children. "You were right, Elara," he said, his voice quiet. "I was looking at the numbers. You were looking at the soul." He cleared his throat. "I'm tabling the negotiations with the developer at the next meeting. I think we can find the funds." The resolution wasn't a single, dramatic moment, but a series of quiet, sunlit ones that followed. The funds were found. A committee was formed to oversee the hall's restoration, with Elara and Sarah as co-heirs. Leo's drawings were hung in the library as a special exhibit titled "The Colors of Cookhaven." He started school again, And while he was still a quiet boy, his silence was no longer a wall, but a peaceful space he carried within him. He spoke when he had something to say. The little white house on Sycamore Street was different now. It was still a house of memories. But they were no longer ghosts. They were welcome guests. The dust cover for the piano was folded away in a chest in the attic, never to be used again. The sound of music was a daily occurrence, a blend of Lily's improving skills and Elara's own tentative chords. She was relearning the songs Michael had taught her, her fingers slowly remembering the shapes of joy. One evening, they were all gathered in the living room. Sarah and Lily had come over for dinner. As they often did, the air was filled with the comfortable chatter of a family, one born not of blood, but of shared kindness. Elara was at the piano, playing a simple lullaby. Leo was curled up in the big armchair, not drawing but reading a book. He looked up as she finished the song. "Grandma," he said, his voice soft in the quiet room. "Yes, Leo? Can you teach me how to play?" Elara looked at her grandson, at his bright, curious eyes, at the small smile on his face. She thought of the long, silent years, of the heavy blanket of grief, and of the incredible, improbable journey that had led them back to the light. She smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes and warmed her from the inside out. "I would love that," she said. "We can start right now." She patted the space beside her on the worn velvet bench. And as Leo came and sat down, his small hands hovering over the keys just as Lily's once had, Elara knew that the silence was truly over. The music had returned, not just to the piano but to their lives, and it was here to stay.